The sound of an unfamiliar key turning in front of my door made my heart stop. Through the crack in the blinds, I could see her fumbling with my door as if it belonged to her. When the key didn't fit, she pulled out her phone and called 911, making up a ridiculous story about ownership while I watched silently. She had no idea who was on the other end of the line. I'd had enough of the arrogance and false imposition of that self-proclaimed home. But today, the wheels of justice were in motion, and they were rolling toward the truth in a way she didn't expect. I just had to sit tight because the first blow was coming from that familiar voice on the switchboard. My name is David Miller, and at 47 years old, I thought I'd left my days of conflict resolution behind me. After 25 years as a Navy officer, I'd retired to work for a small security consulting firm in this quiet suburb called Maplewood Estates. Margaret Henderson was 49, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed guardian of community standards for the past 3 years. With her meticulously maintained blonde hair and that emerald green blazer she wore like armor, she treated maintaining community standards as her sacred mission. My son Jake, 28, worked as a dispatcher for the city's 911 emergency center, a job he loved because it allowed him to help people in their darkest moments. The trouble started innocently enough when I planted a single red rose bush in my front yard. The morning sun was just breaking through the oak trees when Margaret appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, her emerald blazer perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Her smile was cold and calculated as she handed me a formal citation printed on HOA letterhead. "Mr. Miller, you violated Section 4.7 of our community guidelines," she announced, her voice dripping with authority. "Red roses are explicitly prohibited under our approved color palette. Only white or pale pink varieties are permitted in front yard landscape." I took the paper, noting the $200 fine printed in bold letters. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but I don't recall seeing this regulation in any of the documents I received when I purchased the house 6 months ago." Her laugh was patronizing, the kind reserved for children who didn't understand adult conversations. "The regulations were comprehensively updated last month, Mr. Miller. All residents receive notification via email. You have exactly 48 hours to comply or face additional penalties." That evening, I called Jake to share what I considered an absurd encounter with our overzealous HOA president. My son's initial laughter quickly turned into something more serious as he processed what I told him. "Dad, that's interesting timing," Jake said, his dispatcher training evident in his measured tone. "I processed a call earlier today from your neighborhood. A woman reported suspicious activity involving a middle-aged man digging in his yard during daylight hours. She claimed he might be burying something illegal." "What was the address she gave?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Yours, Dad?" "I had to send a patrol car to check it out, but obviously they found nothing suspicious about a homeowner planting flowers in his own garden. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I realized Margaret's campaign against me was just beginning." Margaret's offensive escalated with military precision over the following days. She appeared at my property every morning like clockwork, always impeccably dressed in her emerald blazer, always carrying that damn clipboard. Her inspections became increasingly creative in their scope and increasingly punitive in their outcomes. On Tuesday, she cited me for excessive curbside vehicle storage after my car had been parked on the street for exactly 23 minutes while I unloaded groceries. The fine was $50, accompanied by a lecture about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our streetscape. Wednesday brought a violation for non-compliance with lawn maintenance standards. She produced a measuring tape from her blazer pocket and demonstrated that my grass was allegedly 1 3/4 inches tall, exceeding the maximum height of 1 1/2 inches established by community guidelines. I maintained my lawn at the same height as every other house on the street. I protested, gesturing toward my neighbor's identical grass length. "Perhaps your neighbors are also in violation," Margaret replied with a satisfied smirk. "I'll be conducting comprehensive inspections throughout the community to ensure universal compliance." Thursday's citation focused on my front door color, which Margaret claimed was autumn sage rather than the approved forest sage specified in the community paint palette. The difference was indiscernible to my eye, but Margaret's trained aesthetic sensibilities apparently detected the violation immediately. "Mr. Miller, Attention to detail is what separates quality communities from declining neighborhoods, she explained, her tone suggesting she was educating a particularly slow student. Property values depend on consistent adherence to established standards. Each time I requested to see the actual regulations she referenced, Margaret dismissed my concerns with practiced ease. The documents are currently being digitized and compiled into a comprehensive community handbook, she would say. Until then, residents must simply trust the expertise of elected HO. Her smugness suggested she'd perfected this routine through repeated use. But what Margaret didn't know was that I'd begun conducting my own investigation into the legal framework surrounding my property purchase. During my research into the purchase contract and associated documents, I discovered something that would change everything. My house hadn't been acquired from a typical previous owner selling their residence. Instead, I'd purchased directly from Maplewood Development Corporation, the original construction company that had built our entire subdivision. More importantly, the deed research revealed that the development company still technically owned my specific lot and had never transferred management authority to any homeowners association. This meant that, legally speaking, I wasn't subject to HOA governance at all. Armed with this knowledge, I began watching Margaret's increasingly aggressive tactics with growing amusement rather than frustration. Every fine she issued was completely without legal foundation. Every regulation she cited was meaningless regarding my property. The situation reached a crescendo when Margaret announced her intention to organize an emergency HOA meeting specifically to address what she termed the Miller problem. Her formal invitation, printed on official-looking letterhead, arrived in every mailbox throughout our neighborhood. The board has identified a pattern of non-compliance that threatens the harmony and property values of our community, the notice declared. All residents are strongly encouraged to attend this critical discussion of our neighborhood's future. I knew that Margaret's theatrical presentation would be my opportunity to turn the tables, but first I needed to understand exactly how deep her deception ran. The emergency meeting drew 30 neighbors to the community center, a modest building that Margaret had transformed into her courtroom for the evening. She'd arranged the chairs in theater-style seating with herself positioned behind a table at the front, like a judge preparing to render verdict. Margaret had clearly spent considerable time preparing her presentation. She'd created a PowerPoint slideshow titled Maintaining Community Standards, the Miller Case Study, and had printed handouts for every attendee. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, she began reading from her prepared statement with theatrical indignation that would have impressed seasoned courtroom attorneys. Fellow residents, we gather tonight to address a serious threat to the community harmony we've worked so diligently to create and maintain. She clicked through slides showing photographs of my property, each image annotated with red arrows pointing to alleged violations. My red rose bush appeared in multiple photos, circled and labeled as unauthorized botanical installation. Mr. Miller has consistently violated established community standards, Margaret continued, her voice rising with practiced outrage. He has refused to cooperate with legitimate HOA directives, shown complete disregard for the property values we work so hard to protect, and demonstrated a pattern of defiance that cannot be tolerated. Several neighbors nodded along with her presentation, clearly intimidated by her authoritative presence and official-sounding documentation. When she called for a community vote to impose a $2,000 fine and demand my immediate compliance with all regulations, I decided it was time to respond. I stood up slowly, meeting Margaret's confident gaze with a calm smile. I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns, Margaret. However, I'd like to review the original HOA regulations before responding to your allegations. Margaret's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment before her authority reasserted itself. Mr. Miller, you have absolutely no right to question the decisions of this duly lead board. Your continued obstruction only proves the points I've outlined tonight. The crowd murmured their agreement, but I remained standing, my military bearing evident in my posture. I'm simply requesting to see the documentation that supports these regulations. Surely that's a reasonable request from any homeowner, and regulations are established HOA policy. Margaret snapped, her professional demeanor beginning to crack. Your compliance is mandatory, not optional. That's when I knew she was running a complete bluff, and that her entire authority structure was built on nothing more than intimidation and assumption. The following week brought Margaret's most audacious power play yet. I was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning when I heard vehicles pulling into my driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Margaret stepping out of her sedan, followed by a locksmith carrying a toolbox and key-cutting equipment. She approached my front door with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged, her emerald blazer perfectly pressed despite the early hour. When I opened the door, she didn't even attempt to explain her presence diplomatically. Mr. Miller, according to Section 12.44 of the HOA emergency provisions, I have the authority to secure any property that poses an immediate threat to community standards and safety, she announced, producing an official-looking document from her leather portfolio. I'm exercising that authority today to prevent further deterioration of neighborhood compliance. This locksmith will be changing your locks, and you'll receive new keys once you've addressed all outstanding violations and paid the required fines. I didn't interfere with the locksmith's work, instead recording everything on my phone while calling my old friend Marcus, a real estate attorney who'd served with me during my Navy years. I knew that Margaret had just made the biggest legal mistake of her self-appointed career. Marcus listened to my account with growing amusement before bursting into laughter. David, do you realize what you've just witnessed? If an HOA actually changed your locks without proper legal authority, they violated at least 5 federal laws regarding property rights and unlawful seizure. What should I do? I asked, watching Margaret supervise the lock installation with obvious satisfaction. Document everything. Don't resist and let them dig their hole as deep as possible, Marcus advised. Then we'll bury them in it legally. That night, as I checked into a hotel room, I realized that Margaret had handed me the perfect weapon to destroy her fabricated authority once and for all. With 25 years of military experience behind me, I understood that information warfare required patience, precision, and overwhelming preparation. I began systematically documenting every interaction with Margaret, installing high-definition security cameras around my property, and most importantly, diving deep into the legal documentation surrounding Maplewood Estates. Jake became my unofficial intelligence source, sharing information that painted a disturbing picture of Margaret's behavior. Over the past 3 weeks, she had called 911 12 separate times to report various alleged violations from my address. Dad, it's unprecedented, Jake explained during one of our evening conversations. She's reported suspicious noise when you were mowing your lawn at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, questionable activity when you received packages from online retailers, and possible drug activity when you had pizza delivered on Friday night. What did the responding officers find? I asked. Absolutely nothing every single time. They're starting to recognize her voice when she calls, and there's talk about citing her for misuse of emergency services if this continues. Through my research, I discovered that Margaret had unilaterally updated numerous HOA regulations without any resident input or voting, which violated state law requiring 30-day advance notice and at least 60% resident approval for any rule changes. But the most damaging discovery came when I began investigating Margaret's financial arrangements with the HOA. My conversations with other neighbors revealed the true scope of Margaret's systematic intimidation campaign throughout our community. She had weaponized the HOA against virtually every resident, creating a climate of fear that kept people from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived 3 houses down, confided that she'd been fined repeatedly for increasingly absurd violations. She charged me $75 for leaving my newspaper on the front porch for 15 minutes while I was in the bathroom. Mrs. Patterson whispered as if Margaret might be listening. Tom Johnson, a mechanic who works swing shifts, had been fined for washing his car at 10 o'clock in the morning instead of the approved time window between 9 and 9:30. She said the noise from my water hose violated quiet hours, even though it was broad daylight, and I was being as quiet as possible. When I spoke with Tom Wilson, a retired civil engineer, he revealed the depth of the community's intimidation. She's turned our HOA into her personal thief, he said, looking around nervously as if Margaret might materialize from the shadows. But who's going to fight back? She threatens lawsuits against anyone who questions her authority, and most people can't afford legal battles over neighborhood disputes. That conversation motivated me to dig deeper into Margaret's financial arrangements, and what I found was absolutely stunning. My investigation revealed that Margaret had established a private consulting company called Maplewood Property Management Services. 18 months earlier, the HOA had been paying this company $5,000 monthly for undefined community management and compliance services. Essentially, Margaret was paying herself $60,000 annually from HOA funds without any resident knowledge, approval, or oversight. David, I've got news that's going to blow your mind, Marcus said during our phone call. I've spent the morning at the county courthouse researching Maplewood Estates, and what I found is absolutely incredible. The development company never officially transferred management rights for your specific lot to any homeowners association. According to recorded deeds, your property exists in a legal gray area where HOA authority was never properly established. But here's the really interesting part, Marcus continued, his excitement evident in his voice. I also researched Margaret Henderson's appointment as HOA president. There's no record of any election, meeting, or official appointment. She simply declared herself president 3 years ago when the previous president moved to Florida. She has no legal authority whatsoever, I asked. None. Zero. She's been operating a completely fictitious organization and collecting money under false pretenses. David, this woman is going to prison. To test the strength of my legal position, I decided to set a trap that would force Margaret to reveal the extent of her fabricated authority. I deliberately planted a bright yellow sunflower directly in the center of my front yard, knowing that Margaret would be unable to resist taking action. Like clockwork, Margaret appeared at my door the following morning, her clipboard armed with a fresh citation and her emerald blazer pristine, despite the early hour humidity. Mr. Miller, you've now violated Section 7.2.2 regarding unauthorized botanical installations, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Yellow flowering plants are explicitly prohibited in front yard displays. This violation carries a $500 fine. I examined the citation carefully, noting the official-looking seal and formal language. Margaret, I'd like to see the actual regulation you're referencing, along with the meeting minutes where this rule was approved by community vote. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret's perfect composure cracked visibly. Her face flushed red as her voice rose to near shouting level. I am the duly lead president of this homeowners association. My decisions are final and non-negotiable. I understand your position, I replied calmly, but surely you can provide documentation supporting these regulations. That seems like a reasonable request from any homeowner facing substantial fines. You have no right to question my authority, Margaret snapped, her professional demeanor completely dissolving. I don't owe you explanations or documentation. You will comply with community standards or face the consequences. Through my attorney, I sent an official legal request demanding all HOA documentation, including meeting minutes, financial records, election results, and proof of regulatory authority. Margaret's response came through her own lawyer 2 days later, threatening to sue me for systematic harassment and deliberate disruption of legitimate community operations. That's when Marcus called with the final piece of information that would end Margaret's reign of terror permanently. The catalyst for our ultimate confrontation came when Margaret committed an act so outrageous that even her most intimidated supporters couldn't ignore it. While I was visiting Jake for a long weekend, she decided to make her boldest move yet. I returned home Sunday evening to find my house completely inaccessible. Margaret had not only changed my locks again, but had also installed a bright orange notice on my front door, declaring the property secured by HOA authority due to severe and repeated violations of community standards. The notice, printed on official-looking letterhead, instructed me to contact HOA administrative offices immediately to schedule compliance consultation and fine payment procedures before property access will be restored. I called the police immediately, and Officer Martinez arrived within 20 minutes. He was a veteran law enforcement officer who clearly dealt with HOA disputes before, and his expression grew increasingly incredulous as I explained the situation. Sir, let me make sure I understand this correctly. Officer Martinez said, reviewing my property ownership documents. You own this house outright. You've never missed any legitimate HOA payments. And this woman changed your locks because you planted flowers she didn't like. That's essentially correct, officer. She claims authority under HOA regulations, but I've never been able to see any documentation supporting her claims. Officer Martinez shook his head in amazement. Sir, nobody has the legal right to change your locks without your explicit permission, regardless of any HOA rules. This is clearly illegal trespassing and property tampering. That's when Margaret arrived. Margaret stepped out of her sedan wearing her signature emerald blazer, radiating the supreme confidence of someone who'd never faced serious legal consequences for her actions. She approached Officer Martinez with the bearing of someone accustomed to intimidating authority figures into compliance. Officer, I'm Margaret Henderson, the duly lead president of Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, she announced, extending her hand for a handshake. That Officer Martinez politely declined. I appreciate your prompt response to this community disturbance. Man, this gentleman says you changed the locks on his house without permission. Do you have legal documentation authorizing that action? Margaret's smile was condescending, the expression of someone explaining simple concepts to children. Officer, I have complete authority under HOA regulations to secure any property that threatens community standards and safety. Mr. Miller has been repeatedly non-compliant with established guidelines. Ma'am, do you have court orders, liens, or other legal documents that would give you authority over someone else's private property? I don't need court orders, Margaret replied, her tone suggesting the question was absurd. I am the HOA president. My authority is established by community charter and state law. Officer Martinez looked at me with barely concealed amusement. Sir, would you like to press charges for criminal trespassing and property damage? I considered the offer carefully, but I had something much better in mind than simple criminal charges. Actually, officer, I'd like to request an emergency community meeting first. I think all the residents deserve to understand what's been happening in their name. Margaret's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered her composure. Of course, Mr. Miller, I'd be happy to explain community standards to our neighbors once again. That evening, 45 residents gathered in the community center for what would become the most dramatic homeowners association meeting in Maplewood's history. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about police involvement and lock changing, drawing a crowd that included several residents who'd never attended HOA meetings before. Margaret had prepared extensively for this confrontation. She'd created an elaborate PowerPoint presentation titled Community Standards and Problem Residents, and had arranged the meeting room like a formal hearing with herself positioned at a table facing the assembled crowd. Dressed in a freshly pressed emerald blazer and carrying her ever-present clipboard, Margaret opened the meeting with prosecutorial intensity that would have impressed experienced trial attorneys. Fellow residents, we gather tonight under unfortunate circumstances that perfectly illustrate the challenges facing our community. She began her voice carrying the moral authority of someone fighting for justice. Mr. Miller has engaged in a systematic campaign of defiance against established community standards, refused to cooperate with legitimate HOA directives, and recently threatened our organization with frivolous legal action. She clicked through slides detailing my alleged crimes with methodical precision. Photographs of my red roses appeared with detailed annotations explaining their violation of approved color palettes. Images of my car parked on the street were accompanied by timestamps showing duration of curbside storage. Even my front door appeared in her presentation with close-up photos allegedly demonstrating non-compliance with approved paint colors. But property values throughout our community depend on consistent adherence to established aesthetic standards. Margaret continued, her presentation building toward its climax. When individual residents place their personal preferences above community welfare, everyone suffers the consequences through decreased home values and neighborhood deterioration. Several neighbors nodded along with her arguments, clearly swayed by her professional presentation and apparent command of regulatory details. Margaret had cultivated an image of expertise and authority that was difficult to challenge without comparable preparation. When she finished her formal presentation, Margaret looked directly at me with obvious satisfaction. Now, Mr. Miller, would you like to explain to your neighbors why you believe your personal preferences should override community standards that protect everyone's property values? The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward me. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, and I stood up slowly, connecting my laptop to the meeting room's projection system. Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate this opportunity to share some information that I believe everyone should know, I said, my military bearing evident as I faced the assembled crowd. I prepared my own presentation that addresses the foundation of HOA authority in our community. My first slide displayed California state law regarding homeowners association governance and regulation changes. The legal text was dense but clear in its requirements for legitimate HOA operations. According to state law, any changes to HOA rules or regulations require 30-day advanced written notice to all residents and approval from at least 60% of homeowners through formal voting procedures. I explained, watching Margaret's confident expression begin to shift. Margaret, could you please show us the voting records and meeting minutes where these new regulations were approved by community members? Margaret's face began wringing as she attempted to maintain her authority. Those regulations were necessary updates that didn't require individual voting procedures. She stammered, her usual confidence clearly shaken. I clicked to my second slide displaying financial records that Marcus had helped me obtain through public information requests. This documentation shows that Margaret established a private company called Maplewood Property Management Services, and our HOA has paid this company $60,000 over the past year without any resident knowledge or approval. The room erupted in whispers as residents began connecting the dots about where their HOA fees had been disappearing. My third slide displayed official county records that would end Margaret's shad permanently. Most importantly, here's documentation from Orange County Court showing that my property was purchased directly from the original developer and was never legally transferred to HOA Management Authority. According to recorded deeds, the HOA has no legitimate governance over my property whatsoever. The room fell completely silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. If Margaret had no authority over my property, then every fine she'd issued was fraudulent, and every regulation she'd enforced was meaningless. Further, my continued, according to court records and HOA documentation, Margaret Henderson was never actually elected to serve as HOA president. She simply appointed herself to the position 3 years ago when the previous president moved to Florida. There are no records of any election, appointment, or community authorization for her assumed authority. Just then, Jake stood up from his seat in the back row where he'd been quietly observing the proceedings. I hadn't asked him to attend, but he'd come to support his father during what he knew would be a pivotal confrontation. I'm Jake Miller, David's son,